Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We're delighted to have so many of you participating. I think that this topic is very timely, and if there's one positive thing that's come out of the Me Too movement, it's that public attention to this topic has increased noticeably over the last few months. Just a little bit of a warning, we're talking about sexual violence today. That topic can be triggering and difficult for some people. So if you are triggered by our discussion, if you feel the need to talk to someone and need help processing your emotions, I do encourage you to reach out to some of our supports here in Ontario and in Canada. So we have a couple of phone numbers here. My apologies. That's our conference line. Seems like everybody has disconnected. So we have some support here in Ontario and in Canada that are here to support you. So I encourage you to reach out if that is helpful for you. So we will be looking at three main things today during the webinar. We will be looking at the root causes of gender-based violence and how an understanding of those root causes and addressing them can help us prevent this violence. At White Ribbon, we particularly focus on the role of men and boys to end gender-based violence, helping men and boys acquire the tools they need to be allies and to take accountability and responsibility in terms of supporting women and girls and helping prevent and end gender-based violence in our communities. And finally, we will be looking at how consent education and bystander education can help prevent sexual violence, and look at how educators can use some of the tools we've developed to implement activities in their classrooms and their communities in Ontario and across the country and beyond. And as I mentioned, the White Ribbon Campaign is the world's largest movement of men and boys working to end violence against women and girls. We also work to promote gender equality and equity and healthy relationships and a healthy vision of masculinities. And we believe that men are part of the solution and that they are part of a future that is safe and equitable for all people. So they have a role and responsibility to play. So we believe that men need to be involved to create the changes that we need to end violence against women and girls and other forms of gender-based violence. We use a non-blaming and non-shaming approach, and we look to give men the tools they need to become allies and make a positive difference in their community. So one of our core tenets here is that gender-based violence is not a women's issue. It is definitely everyone's issue, and men and boys have a role to play supporting women and girls in our collective efforts to end gender-based violence. So violence in our communities has several interconnected root causes, the first of which is social learning. So what we learn as we are socialized in our communities, in our schools, in our homes, and from our popular culture. And those groups can often perpetuate some notions about gender roles and expectations that are not healthy and can potentially lead to violence. Violence is also rooted in gender inequality, and we're talking about a couple of thousand years of patriarchy here, and a system which holds that women are inherently inferior to men. That non-binary folks and gender non-conforming folks are also inferior. And these ideas have been part of our culture and societies for so long that deconstructing them and moving from patriarchy and inequality to equity and equality will take concerted efforts. And in Canada particularly, and elsewhere in the world as well, when we look at violence and gender-based violence, we have to remember the role of colonialism in creating systems of violence to subject peoples and allowing for really undermining and breaking apart traditional family structures, and which can create cycles of violence and intergenerational trauma. And finally, one of the biggest roots of gender-based violence that we on which we focus here at White Ribbon are those harmful and violent aspects of masculinity, talking about toxic masculinity. And if you have been following the events here in Toronto, where there was a very violent attack yesterday, it seems that toxic masculinity played a role in the motivation behind that horrific act. So whenever we talk about violence and gender-based violence, it is important to take a critical look at constructions of gender norms, including constructions of masculinity. So sexual violence is pervasive in Canada, as it is throughout the world, and sexual violence is gendered, meaning that the vast majority of victims of sexual violence are women and girls. So during their lifetime, 1 in 3 women in Canada will be the subject of some sexual violence and sexual assault, and 1 in 6 men will also experience sexual violence. In the case of men, the majority of the victims experience or victimized during their youth. Sexual violence is also gendered because the overwhelming majority of perpetrators are male. So we're talking about a violence that is often committed by men and directed at women and girls, or gender non-conforming groups. And when we look at the additional risk factors for victims of sexual violence, we know that in our communities, individuals who have disabilities or cognitive impairments are at a much higher risk of experiencing sexual violence. So are Indigenous women and girls, trans women, and gender non-conforming folks. And one thing that we need to keep in mind as educators and people working in the education sector is that age plays a huge role as well in terms of sexual violence victimization. Young people are at a much higher risk of experiencing that type of violence as opposed to adults. Young women between the ages of 15 and 24, for example, have the highest risk of experiencing sexual assault in our communities. So we have a duty as educators and folks working with youth to give them the tools they need and the skills they need to stand up for themselves, but also to give them the tools they need to spot things and cases that could be harmful, situations that are potentially threatening, and give them the tools to step in if they can, or get help so that they are able to prevent sexual violence. And we also have a duty to talk about how gender norms are construed and constructed in our communities, and how we can work together to promote healthier and more flexible gender expectations in our communities. So one of the things we do in a lot of our programming here at White Ribbon is take a critical look at gender norms, particularly at toxic masculinity. And we do this not to blame young men and other men for having been raised that way or feeling that they need to behave that way, but rather to give them a sort of critical distance so that they are able to see and understand where this comes from. They're able to see and perceive all the pressures that operate and push them to act or behave a certain way. And ultimately, as a way of deconstructing those pressures and freeing and empowering men to break free of that man box, of that gender box. And this is important when we talk with youth, because fitting in and peer pressure and conforming is something that a lot of young people are looking for. Breaking out of these boxes are particularly difficult for young people who are trying to understand how they fit in their societies, in their communities. And it's a little bit easier as adults once you have a better sense of who you are as a person. But doing this exercise is never wasted. And when we do this exercise with very young people, they do get it. They do understand, and they do see all those pressures that operate and those pressures that affect them and push them to act a certain way, which and all of these norms and expectations that can lead to violence. So when we do this exercise, no matter the audience, they are very often able to come up with something that very closely resembles this man box that you're seeing on your screen right now. So those expectations that a successful man, a true man, will behave in those ways. He'll be fearless and emotionless and successful and tough and dominant and control, aggressive, even powerful, strong. Sometimes that he'll be a player, and the old provider trope, they're still very much influential in our society. And as much progress as we've made moving beyond that box, those pressures are still there, and they still have to be reckoned with. And when we do that exercise, what is quite interesting is that the terms and the insults that are used to police men's masculinity when they're trying to break free of that box, or when they're not seen as conforming to these stereotypes in that box, is that those terms are usually sexist or homophobic. So, and that contributes to violence against women and girls and LGBTQ folks, because it positions them in a way as less than men who are at the core of this box. And this exercise is also helpful because trying to conform to that box, trying to conform to those ideals and stereotypes, does have harmful impacts on women and girls who are the subject of violence, but also on men who are experience adverse effects to their well-being based on these expectations to conform to those stereotypes. So if we look, there have been several studies done that shows that trying to conform to those toxic gender norms can have negative impacts on young men and older men's physical and emotional health, on their resiliency, and on their ability to reach out for help when things are not going well. I don't know if you've paid attention to the recent news story, but Dwayne Johnson, also known as The Rock, came out a couple of weeks ago with his own story of dealing with depression and other mental health issues and reaching out for help. And that was an extremely powerful moment for us and for other members of our community, because he's often held as the epitome of masculinity. He's a male role model. He's the alpha male, perhaps, if you think about it. That's how he's portrayed in popular culture and in media. And then it is a very powerful moment when a man admits that he has needed help, that his mental health and well-being that he needed help addressing some of those issues, and that it is okay to reach out when things are not going well, and that you don't have to keep things bottled up, and that you can find a constructive outlet for those difficult emotions and feelings and experiences. Another part of critical discussions of gender norms with young people, young men, and older adult men is also talking about emotional intelligence and helping counter this idea that men should be stoic and emotionless, and moving from what this comical depiction of Darth Vader's feelings on the left, where there is no visible change in his demeanor, to allowing our young men and other men in our lives to express a full range of emotion. And all of those emotions on the emotions wheel. So it's very helpful to help educate young people, including young women. Actually, everybody can benefit from developing our emotional intelligence. So we're talking about recognizing a variety of emotions. That's the first step of developing our emotional intelligence. But also the ability of accepting and acknowledging that we're having those emotions and being able ultimately to manage them in a constructive way. The reason why emotional intelligence is so important when we're talking about violence prevention is that oftentimes in our society, men are told that they can experience a limited number of emotions. We're talking about joy, anger, and sadness. So these are the emotions that are most commonly accepted and acceptable for men. And if we're not giving them the tools they need to recognize the full range of the emotions they might be experiencing, it is possible, and it does happen, that the default emotion becomes anger, and that anger can lead to violence. So it is important to help men deal with their emotions, including those very difficult emotions, which nobody likes to experience, but it is all the more important that we are able to deal with those emotions in a constructive way, and not resort to violent outbursts and anger and other non-constructive ways of dealing with those difficult emotions. So the work we do at White Ribbon really focuses on helping young people develop a critical understanding of gender norms, giving them the tools and the confidence they need to break out of those gender boxes, and helping them understand that there are multiple ways of being a man, of living their manhood, and that healthy masculinities are not defined by using violence against women and girls, or by how much pain you can endure, or your stoicism. It is also not defined by your position of power, how you can exert power over others, and it is not defined by your sexual orientation. And it is important to have a critical look at those gender norms, because consent education needs to be linked to those critical discussions of gender norms and male privilege and male entitlement. Consent education is very useful, and it is very important, and we'll look at it in a second. But it is not uncommon that male perpetrators know that they don't have consent, but that doesn't stop them. They often know that they're abusing their positions of power, that they're coercing or manipulating another person, but oftentimes they don't care because they have a warped vision of women. They feel entitled to women's attention and women's bodies, and they see women as inferior or existing for their pleasure. And these perceptions, these ideas built into player culture or bro culture should be addressed critically Otherwise, consent education won't have the full impact that it should have. These discussions are a very important entry point into further discussions about sexual violence prevention. So to end rape culture, we always say that we need to create a consent culture. So we need to replace this idea that sexual violence is not a big deal, that victims are in some way responsible for having for the violence that they've experienced, moving away from the objectification of women in popular culture, and promote a culture where asking for permission and respecting people's boundaries and respecting people's decisions without calling names is just the norm. So that's what we mean by consent culture, and that doesn't just apply to sexual encounters and activity. Consent culture is something that we should cultivate in our daily life, and we're talking about simply respectful relationships with everyone in our lives. As you may know, consent is not simply no means no. Our understanding and teaching about consent has evolved pretty significantly in recent years thanks to the advocacy of rape and sexual assault centers and feminist organizations and young people in our community in Ontario to make sure that there is comprehensive consent education in our schools and elsewhere in our communities. So when I was a young person, we were taught that consent is no means no, but we all know now that it is much more complicated than that, and that consent is a two-way ongoing street, and that it is necessary to actively consent to sexual encounters every time. And we're talking about a couple of principles such as consent is mutual, it's enthusiastic, it's ongoing, and it can be retracted at any time. It is specific, it is voluntary, so it is not coerced, the person is not manipulated, and the person is not intoxicated. It means that they're able to make enlightened decisions and that they are not intoxicated and incapable of making decisions because of their consumption of drugs or alcohol. And we also know that consent is not automatic, so it is not automatic in the context of a relationship. And when we're working with young people, it is very important to talk about coercion and manipulation and guilt tripping. Some recent studies in Ontario have shown that 27% of grade 11 female students reported that they have been pressured to engage in sexual behavior against their will. So peer pressure, gender expectations, guilt tripping and manipulation do play a great role there. And 15% of those female students also reported having engaged in oral sex to avoid intercourse. So there is clearly something going on here, and if we don't address coercion and manipulation and guilt tripping when working with young people, we're not serving them. And this includes telling young women that they have a right to say no, but also it includes working with young boys, young cisgender heterosexual boys, to tell them that manipulation and coercion and all of that is not okay, and that consent needs to be given freely every time. Now, in terms of your votes, looking at how many Canadians have a good understanding of consent, I can give you the right answer. So basically, only 1 in 3 Canadians have has a very comprehensive understanding of what consent means. And that means that 67% of Canadians do not have a good understanding of consent. And it's not just young people. We're talking about a lot of adults in our communities who do not have a full understanding of consent. Another piece that has proven effective in terms of sexual violence prevention, and that's very popular in the education sector, is bystander education. So a bystander is someone who is not a victim or survivor or a perpetrator of sexual violence, but rather someone who is a witness, someone who's on the sideline and who may be in a position to intervene to prevent or interrupt an incident of sexual violence. So why has this been so popular? One of the strengths of bystander education is that it emphasizes the fact that sexual violence is a community issue, it's a societal issue, and we all have a role to play to prevent it and eliminate it from our communities. So it moves the focus away from the survivor and the perpetrator, which can be seen as an individual issue, all the way to our collectivity, and shows that it is a societal issue and everybody has a role to play to prevent and end sexual violence. So it clearly states that it is not a private issue. And bystander education asks us to consider how we can intervene safely and effectively to stop sexual violence. In Ontario, we've developed a number of resources as part of the Draw the Line campaign. There are other such campaigns across Canada and the US. But basically what the campaign does is that it asks you to consider how you might intervene or what you would do in a situation that could be problematic, where a situation that could be threatening or dangerous. And these are pretty common situations, so it forces us all to think about what we would do in those situations. It forces us all to think about it so that we're better prepared when we might encounter those situations in our daily lives or elsewhere. And there's a whole spectrum of resources. I think that if you go to the drawtheline.ca website, you'll see a wide variety of scenarios. I think there are over 30 of them that have been developed at this moment. And it covers a whole spectrum of sexual violence. And I gave you a couple of examples here from the potential of alcohol-facilitated sexual assault on the left, to what do we do as a culture, as a society, as a community, when someone is accused of sexual misconduct. If you're interested in participating, I've created a little poll asking you how you would respond to that question on the one about your teammate accused of sexual misconduct. If you want to chime in and fill the poll and let me know how you would respond in that situation, then we can see and use that as a jumping point for the rest of our discussion. So this is a scenario that has triggered a lot of reactions in recent years. We've had a lot of people saying they're innocent until they're proven guilty. That's an argument we've heard several times. Some people are okay to cheer for the team, but they don't want to cheer for that person. And some people draw the line at no, I will not support anything that condones implicitly or explicitly sexual misconduct. And that's fine. That's what the scenario is meant to do. It is meant to start a conversation about where individuals draw the line, what they consider to be acceptable, what they consider to be unacceptable, and what they would do. And I see that someone here has mentioned that they would not cheer for that team. They would write to the management to ask them to be let go. And this is an interesting question too, because it asks us a question that has been on our minds a lot lately, which is, how do we deal with perpetrators? And society as a whole is not a law court. The burden of proof is not as high, and it shouldn't be as high in terms of what we do and how we choose to respond to sexual violence as a community or a society. As a community, we can decide that we will support survivors even if a perpetrator might not be convicted in a court of law, either because the survivor has not reported it or because the process is extremely difficult and obtaining a conviction is extremely hard. So the burden of proof should be lower, and as a society, we can ponder this and think about where do we draw the line? What can we do to support survivors? How can we make sure that survivors are not the ones who are punished, and that we do whatever we can to make sure that public spaces and other places in our communities are safe, that they're not the ones who have to avoid public places because of sexual violence. So all of these draw the line postcards have these provocative scenarios on the front, and on the back you have tips on how to potentially respond in those scenarios. And at White Ribbon, we've developed an array of postcards that are adapted to young people's abilities, taking into account how their ability to intervene is perhaps more limited than it is for adults. They have to take their own safety into consideration. They are young people who have to deal with situations that could be very difficult. So the point that these cards are making is that we shouldn't look away, but that small actions have the potential of making a very big difference. That those small actions include getting help and telling someone you trust so that they can help you resolve a situation. You don't have to do this on your own. It also tells young people that bystanders can show support for survivors. They can be there to listen to them and help them connect with support services if that is right for them. It also helps young people think about how they can help their friends make good choices. So this is the back of the card that is on the left here. At a party, your friend says, those girls look really drunk. Let's take them upstairs. Do you let it happen? And one of the options that are provided here is calling in your friend. Not necessarily calling out, but you can have a discussion with your friend. And the message here is that it is the responsible thing to do is helping your friends make good decisions. It's about being a stand-up friend, and that is indeed countering things like bro culture with things like some of the tenets of that culture, such as, I'm sorry for being expletive here, but bros before hoes, or not cock blocking and things like that, which do come into play when we look at this alcohol-facilitated sexual assault scenario. So instead, we're trying to teach young people that they should be stand-up friends, and they should help their friends make good decisions and look out for each other, and not condone, tolerate, or turn a blind eye when your friend might be tempted to do something that clearly crosses a line. This bystander education campaign also invites people to consider why and when and how they could intervene, but also gets them talking about the risks that are at play and how safety considerations should always be paramount. So we're not telling anyone that they should place themselves at risk, risk of physical harm. That is clearly not the way forward. Bystanders should always be conscious of their own safety, but when it's possible, we encourage them to get help from other people if there is a safety concern. And the discussions we have with young people focus on what would be the impact of intervening as opposed to the impact of non-intervening. There is a strong reflex in our society to say, oh, it's not my own business. I will turn a blind eye to this. I will look away. I won't intervene. I won't get involved. So we have to fight pretty hard against that reflex. But it is important to do that and get young people thinking about what could be the consequences if we chose to intervene, as opposed to what could be the consequences if we chose to do nothing, which includes small things such as checking in on the survivor or the victim. And some of the conversations we have with youth focus on physical safety, but also some of the risks include the fear of losing their social capital, the fear of being ostracized by their friends and family if they choose to intervene in this alcohol-facilitated situation, for example. Would they be ostracized? Would they lose their friends? And things like that are of tremendous importance to young people. So when we have those discussions and when we talk about the fear of losing your social capital and being ostracized by your friends and family, we really focus a lot on this idea of the consequences of intervention as opposed to non-intervention, and focus on the importance of doing the right thing and being a stand-up friend and looking out for each other and doing what we can to make sure that our communities are safe and everyone is respected. Some of the benefits of bystander education. I apologize here. There's a couple of letters are missing. Some conversion issues with Adobe Connect, but I'll read them out to you. So bystander education is beneficial for our communities because it does clearly articulate that that sexual violence is everyone's issue. It is also beneficial because it offers provocative but realistic scenarios that help us normalize conversations about sexual violence. It helps us think about our roles and responsibilities in our community in a way that is both theoretical and realistic, and helps us practice the skills that we need to not look away and to be prepared to intervene, because it does need practicing. We can't assume that we are all ready to intervene in those tricky, difficult situations, and adults can benefit from bystander education too. We have to work hard to counter that none of my business reflex, but also to be able to think on our feet in terms of how we could potentially intervene in a safe way and in an effective way. So we have a lot of resources that help youth practice those skills in the classroom, and I'll get to those in a moment. And bystander education is also helpful because it helps young people recognize cases and situations where there is no consent. So they gain a better understanding of how consent, of what consent and non-consent look like in a day-to-day situation. And bystander education is also useful because you can take a gradual scaffolding approach, and you can start with people at a very young age and teach them to look out for each other and respect boundaries and get help when things don't feel right, when their gut tells them that something isn't right. So there's quite a few studies that have been done that show that a comprehensive bystander education do reduce sexual violence and other forms of interpersonal violence in school communities. So there was a study in Kentucky that a couple of years ago that showed its impact, and all indicators in Canada as well do highlight that this approach is effective. However, I would advise combining bystander education with consent education and critical examinations of gender norms, as I mentioned previously, just so that we don't divorce sexual violence and its prevention from its root causes, and that we do understand that there are some gender dynamics and at play here, and that empowering bystanders and supporting survivors is important, but we also need to address the root causes of that violence and how toxic masculinity does create a culture where that violence can happen. So a couple things that educators and people working in the education sector or with young people can do. First, it's breaking that culture of silence. I think we've made some incredible headway in that area in the last few months, so I encourage you to keep those conversations going in your communities. And this is very helpful because it helps survivors understand that they are not alone, that you are aware that this is an issue and that they can reach out to you for support. That you are likely to believe them and support them if they need help. A culture of silence and the stigma that surrounds sexual violence is not helpful for anyone, and it is definitely not helpful for survivors' recovery. We can also help prevent sexual violence in our communities by promoting consent culture and challenging rape culture whenever we see it in its most innocuous forms, although still very harmful ways. When we talk about sexist or homophobic jokes and comments, all of this contributes to a culture that sees and portrays women and LGBTQ folks as less than men, that contributes to discrimination and to an environment where these people are not respected or don't feel safe. Another important part of sexual violence prevention in your schools and in your communities is that this needs to involve everyone. It has long been held that sexual violence was women's issue. That is not true. It's everyone's issue. Everybody needs to play a role and be involved to end sexual violence in our communities. Men and boys have a role as allies, supporting women and feminists who have done a lot of work in this area in the last decades. I encourage you to have critical discussions about gender norms with your students and use some of our Draw the Line resources in your classrooms, including some of our, if you're interested, we have a guide for educators from grade 1 to grade 8 and from grade 9 to grade 12. These include lesson plans connected to our to the curriculum expectations in Ontario, but the activities can be adapted to any context if your curriculum is slightly different. So we have a large variety of lesson plans included in there that use those draw the line scenarios that we've just looked at and some more to have conversations and classroom activities. It promotes a proactive approach as opposed to a reactive approach to sexual violence. It helps you normalize those conversations in your classroom. The focus is on the bystander, and it engages all students, including the male-identified students in your classrooms. And we take a gradual approach, right? We start in grade 1 and we go all the way to grade 12. So the activities are obviously a lot more developed when you get to grade 12 as opposed to grade 1. But we need to build those skills gradually. We can't expect young people to have a good understanding of consent when they get to middle school or high school if we haven't already taught them about boundaries and respect and standing up for themselves and assertion and reaching out for help when things don't feel right when they were younger. And so if you go to, I'll give you the link at the end of our webinar, but all of those resources are available for free on our website. So you can download those guides and use them in your community. And it is a pretty comprehensive guide. We were aware that everybody's skill and knowledge level was not the same, so we included a comprehensive introduction to the topic of sexual violence, some suggestions on how to introduce this topic in your classroom, including strategies to create a safe space, and additional resources to help support you and your students after those classroom activities. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to scaffold that learning. So using those guides, the younger students, they develop the skills they need to stand up for themselves and to show respect for others and others' boundaries. And we teach them to trust their instinct when things don't feel right, and trust and teach them to get help from someone they trust. And using that base of knowledge, then older students can understand and apply the concept of consent. They can develop healthy, respectful, equitable relationships, and they can develop their skills to be active bystanders and intervene safely and effectively to prevent sexual violence. So a lot of those activities ask students to think about and practice how they would intervene in those situations. So there's a lot of role play and writing and opinion pieces and all of that. And in the guide for secondary educators, there's a whole lesson plan based around those gender boxes that we saw earlier. So if you're interested in that activity, I encourage you to go and have a look at the grades 9 to 12 Drawing the Line guide, where you will find a step-by-step breakdown of a gender box activity that you can implement in your classroom, and you can adapt it for younger people. We've used that activity with young people as young as grade 5 or 6 students. Finally, we all know that role modeling plays an important role for young people, and that young men particularly look towards older men and adults in terms of defining what manhood is and how to behave, what behaviors and attitudes are acceptable. So we created a resource with the Ontario Secondary Teachers Federation, as well as it's another version of it with the Elementary Teachers Federation in Ontario, helping male teachers and male coaches and other male models be good role models for the boys in their lives, and giving them the tools they need to have those conversations about gender equality, about consent, and about healthy relationships with the young people in their lives. So that concludes my portion of the webinar. There's a chat box. If you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat box, and we have a couple of minutes. I'll try to answer as many as I can. You can see the link to the Draw the Line White Ribbon website at the top of the page here. So if you go to dtl.whiteribbon.ca, you will have access to all of those resources we saw today, including the Educator's Guide and more information about requesting professional development workshops for educators across Ontario if you're in the province of Ontario, and other useful resources that you can use in your classrooms and in the post-secondary sector as well. All right, so I see a question from Peggy Chen, your support educators. So our partnership is, we have partnerships with with OSSTF in Ontario and ETFO. We also have partnerships with Principals Association, and basically, with the Ministry of Education here in Ontario. So basically, everyone involved has approved of our projects and our resources. I think that if you're interested in sharing information about this program in your school, I can send you some of our informational material, including some of our pamphlets and a couple of copies of the posters and cards that I've shown you in the previous slides. And you can bring them to your school team and see if a teacher or another member of the school staff would help you bring this in your school. I know that some guidance counselors in some of the schools that we've worked with have taken this on, and they're the ones leading the campaign in their own schools, and they've shared the resources and put the posters up in the hallways. They got copies of the guides to share with the teachers, and that's what they've done. Other schools have had shown our there's a short video. If you go to dtl.whiteribbon.ca on the page for educators, there's a short video of young people discussing the Draw the Line campaign and talking about why it's needed in schools and why they want this type of program and initiative in their schools, because they do see it as an important topic. So you can use that to persuade your school staff and that it is an important issue. So it's a 4-minute video. So I know that some people have shown that during staff meetings, and have used that as a jumping point to convince their school administration. Great. Well, thank you all so much for attending and participating today. Please do not hesitate to send me an email and or go to our website if you have any questions. If you wish to get any of our materials, and I will be happy to support you. Our role is a support role. We want to empower you to bring those conversations in your communities and lead them, and so that we can all work together to prevent sexual violence. And thank you very much for your time, and have a great day, everyone.